We're at the Radical Book Fair, organised by Edinburgh's Lighthouse Bookshop. Describing itself as Scotland's largest literary and political alternative book fair, it's run since 1996. This year it's brought together over 50 writers, artists and publishers. Let's have a look.
The fourth is freedom as sacrifice. And I think this is a real tension within the left between the individual and the collective. Now for me, freedom is a question of sacrifice because it is a zero-sum game. You think about the quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, who said, "Most men today cannot conceive of a freedom that does not involve someone else's slavery." I think that's really important because in order to understand my position in society and my freedom to say things, I have to understand that I hold a privilege that is built on the backs of women. The ability to understand where you are in the pecking chain. And I think there's this lack of understanding that a lot of people have about freedom, that freedom is not the ability to inflict as much damage as you want. It's the ability to interact with others and understand your position in relation to them. It's that idea of freedom of sacrifice, that as a man you will have to yield something. But collective freedom is enhanced as a result of you yielding something, is central.
Yes, I wouldn't disagree with any of that stuff. The only issue is that sometimes these questions lead to mind-bending dilemmas and conflicts that could be highly destabilizing. And here, like, no one's mentioned the word intersectionality yet here. Intersectionality, for those that idea, is the idea that was developed by originally by American black feminists, a woman called Kimberly Crenshaw. I think she coined it in about 1989. And this was the idea that different forms of structure, different forms of identification, don't just layer one on top of the other, but they intersect in complex ways. And this gives us a very nuanced, sophisticated way we can look at issues like privilege, because it isn't just the case that a woman is less privileged than a man, and a black woman is doubly less privileged than a man, but it's more to do with these very complicated issues where people have to be aware of where they're coming from and their personal histories and the structures that have led them to where they are. And I think intersectionality is an incredibly useful tool. Unfortunately, particularly online, in online debates, it often leads to a very crude, reductive understanding of privilege. There's a book, there's a whole series of books on intersectionality, and I can't remember the publisher. There's a woman who talks about the oppression Olympics, saying that intersectionality was never about an oppression Olympics, but it's turned into an oppression Olympics. And I think sometimes the term check your privilege, I think, is a brilliant term, and I think it should apply to many of us, if not most of us. Unfortunately, again, it tends to sometimes get mired into this sort of competitive approach. And I think part of that is to do with online stuff, which is brutal and reductive, and often leads to these highly conflictual moments where an understanding of what privilege really is, which is a lifetime's quest to understand, certainly if you're a white male like me, precisely how I'm positioned and where I'm positioned and what my ethical responsibilities to others are and how I should speak and behave and whatever, that becomes reduced to a battle over a tweet. And I think that's terribly sad, and it doesn't actually help us to deal with questions about privilege and free speech.
Robert, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, God, I'm going to be that guy. I'm going to go there. Right. Okay. Class, right? I think we're almost in a class analysis. I think one of the issues is that liberals haven't spoken about class, certainly in America, since the destruction of the New Deal. In this country, we haven't effectively talked about class. Class hasn't really been a major underpinning of these social democrats and liberals' understanding about the way the state interacts with the individual, about the way concentration of wealth interacts with the state. I really have a problem with the way the left talks about or uses language or words like privilege. I worry about language more from a strategic point of view than an aesthetic point of view, and that's mostly because having conversations with a lot of either friends or acquaintances, they don't see it as privilege. It might be a privilege, but they don't see it as privilege because it's their normality, right? If you're a man, you can't get it into your thick skull, right? You have privilege over women, right? It's just a natural state for you. You will not be asked at a job interview whether you plan to be pregnant, right? There's so many men, majority of them, who just don't understand this. And so using words like privilege is quite difficult, and it's very easy to be caricatured by the right and the far right as being academic, as being not in touch with the concerns of real working people, whatever euphemisms they like to use. I think when we think about privilege, I think we need to use privilege as a descriptor for the people who push forward a free speech agenda. That they are passing on the idea of privilege to especially white middle class, lower middle class communities that they want to target. The idea of distracting them from the issue of class. Right? So it's the old joke of there's a black guy in a pub, there's 3 poor white guys, and there's a wealthy guy. They've all been involved in a project together, they all buy 10 pints. The rich white guy takes 9 pints. There's 1 pint left on the table, turns around to the 3 poor white guys and says, "Oi, took your pint." And they buy it. They buy it because they don't have the idea of class analysis. Right? And that's why the culture wars are so important. That's why this idea of free speech is so crucial. Because if you can position yourself as a defender of white Christianity, the idea of Europe, the idea of Britain, the idea of a kind of racial purity, then it doesn't really matter that someone's reaching into your pocket. There's one quote that screen captured tons of quotes, juicy quotes out there. So hold on a second. Right, this is one by LBJ. A bit problematic considering, his own private views, but whatever, we'll skate over that. Love this quote. "I'll tell you what's at the bottom of it. If you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than the best coloured man, he won't notice that you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on, and he'll even empty his pockets out for you." I think that's really what's at the heart of this issue around free speech and this manufactured culture war as a distraction from class.
I'll respond to that. Yeah, it does have that function. Yeah, it's certainly true. That's pretty much unarguable. But the problem is when that argument gets reducted, this is a debate that's been going on in theory for decades, but I suppose someone has to reference it, it would be me. The problem is that if you see things like the culture wars and issues such as race as distracting people from knowing where privilege is, then you could be in danger of a reductiveness that sees things like gender or things like race as basically trivial, non-existent things. And that kind of reductive Marxism, certainly reductive Marxism, is certainly not popular these days, and I don't think that's necessarily what you're arguing. But I think it's the question of how you perpetuate an awareness of those sorts of issues without it becoming another spiral to the bottom in the same way that has sometimes happened on intersectionality. And I think that's a question we have to be asking about generally, is how you can render these ideas internet safe.
Just wanted to respond to your point. I don't necessarily think that you need to make it explicit in the sense of going to people and saying, no, you don't understand, comrade. Your practice is all wrong. I remember having a conversation, I was doing a feature on Northern Ireland and sections of the DUP and their role in the Leave vote, the Leave campaign in Northern Ireland. I remember talking to one of the leaders of the DUP at a local level, and we had a long conversation about Irish history, about unionism, about Protestant ideology, about the Protestant working man, and he had this brief period of clarity in between shouting at me, "This is our possession!" What he said to me was, well, this is what we have. This is all we have. Protestant ideology, the idea of the working man, the idea of being at the Belfast docks, that identity is what we have, because there isn't really a notion of class. And I think there's a two-way conversation I think we should be having. We should have a rather platforming conversation with people like Brendan O'Neill, but we also have to have a conversation on the ground in terms of strategic campaigning with ordinary people, in which we don't say you're wrong or you're an idiot, but actually what we're saying is, where's the money going? It's not the black kid down the road that managed to pocket £8 billion. You know, your life, our lives together can get better, and it's not to do with any restrictions of freedom of speech. It's to do with how much money we have. It's about who has the power in society. It's about who has the power to speak.
So I'll give a brilliant example of how not to have those conversations. I absolutely agree, by the way. Does anybody watch, it's every 7 years, the 7 Up series directed by Michael Active? I think 2 rounds ago, there was an East End, white boy from London's East End, from the Docks area, who wanted to become a jockey when he was a kid, and now I think he became a taxi driver. And they took him back to, he doesn't live there now, I think he lives in the suburbs in Essex or somewhere. And they took him back to the East End, and they showed him with montages of how it's changed and stuff like that. And he was talking about his sadness, it's sort of like his nostalgia for the way it was. And so Michael Acton said, some people would say that's rather racist, and he was incredibly hurt about that. Incredibly hurt about that. Now I think, I'm not so naive to think there isn't a racialised sense about it. Clearly that was part of it, but it was also to do with partly the generalised nostalgia that most middle-aged people have going back, that's, you know, pretty much that most people have anyway. But I think it was also to do with other changes that had happened that had nothing to do, that were not, well, they may have been racialised in the process, but they were also to do with gentrification. They were to do with, and it's reverse, of the pauperisation of certain areas in the East End. And this, I think, was emblematic of the ways that white liberal people often are terrible at speaking to the white working class, by not dealing with, and I absolutely agree with you, and that conversation you had suggested was full of possibilities, but you say that it passed quickly though.
Yeah, it did pass pretty quickly. I mean, it's difficult to kind of get through to someone when they're shouting at you at such a high level. And I have this kind of really quiet voice, so going up against someone from the DUP is just, I've lost already.
Brexit happened, all this kind of, all these votes that a lot of people on the left probably thought would never happen. A lot of that is obviously from working class votes. And I'm just wondering if you think that the fact that a lot of the kind of academic left would tend to think that they kind of speak for a lot of working class people, when actually working class people now are having their voice and saying, this is what we voted for, and the left are kind of saying, you know, no, you're wrong, this isn't good for you, kind of thing, this isn't what you want. Would you think that that's like a freedom of speech issue? Or, I mean, I feel as if sometimes there isn't a platform for like Britain's underclass that isn't the far right. I don't know if you can just give me your thoughts on that.
So I come from a Windrush working class background. I had the chance through schooling to basically become the parody of bourgeois leftists on AC. Exactly, seriously. My mum's definitely very disappointed in me. And I think that liberals are definitely to blame. Brexit wasn't a surprise to me at all. I was actually surprised that Brexit won by such a slim margin. And one of the reasons is, well, yeah, exactly. That always has to be mentioned, yeah. But certainly with regards to England and Wales, I think one of the reasons why I felt that way is certainly when I think about all my friends who basically were not white and Polish, our experiences of being in Britain have been so ambiguous that asking us will Brexit happen is like saying, do you think Britain is fundamentally racist or has a massive problem with its national identity or has a massive underclass which has been cut and left adrift? Yes to all 3 questions. So of course it's going to happen. What we've seen is a hollowing out of working class institutions, we've seen the destruction of trade unions, We've seen the liberal seizure of working class hubs, such as the Labour Party, which, yes, may have done really nice things like Sure Start centres during Blair's tenure, but of course you have issues such as PFI, you have issues such as not resolving massive economic tensions and inequalities that are at the root of Britishness. And you look at places like Middlesbrough, you look at places like Sunderland. Middlesbrough, well, I think it's 40% of most high streets, main streets. You have the front shops boarded up. You walk down these places and they're bereft of hope. And so it's completely understandable. I mean, like you were saying, it is enraging because you look there and you think, you shouldn't be angry at me, you shouldn't be angry at someone who's Polish or someone who's Romanian. But for me, the anger and the blame should be specifically, not even at the people who led the Brexit campaign, it's specifically directed at the liberal elite who took for granted that their world vision would remain dominant. And now they've woken up to a nightmare in which they cannot control the dialogue, the national dialogue, and now they complain about there being a post-truth age. You lost this.